The next area we're going to be looking at is society and culture in the Golden Age. So in this summary, we're going to go through all the key points that you need to know about women, about the youth. We're going to talk about what it was like for Jewish people, and we're also going to look at culture and all the different forms and its impact. So this is another key area of the spec. It hasn't really come up much recently in the exam, so it's definitely something I think could come up this year. It's definitely worth making some notes as we go through, because there's going to be quite a lot of information. You might even want to start with a red pen, black pen activity where you start writing what you know about those aspects of society and culture, and maybe then adding to it as we go through it, because there is quite a lot more information than with the economy. It's definitely worth writing down a few notes at least as we go through it, just to kind of keep your mind focused as we talk through the key info. So just doing a bit of an introduction to social and cultural developments then. Now, these are essentially brought about by the First World War and its aftermath, and it's obviously causing extensive social and cultural changes in Germany. Now, obviously, politically, they had a revolution, or at least a revolutionary situation, where they ended up getting their Kaiser to abdicate, and they have obviously created the Weimar Republic. Now, the Weimar Constitution was all about the freedom of the people. The Bill of Rights is the first thing in it, and the idea was that they were going to have more rights than before, more freedom, opportunities, and greater equality than they'd ever been allowed before. For instance, under the Kaiser, there had been things like censorship. Now, we know that Germany was an incredibly divided society, both politically and socially as well, and there were people that supported these changes and supported the Weimar Republic and its kind of spirit, but there were also other people that lamented the passing of a way of life in which roles, responsibilities and authority had been clearly defined and society had been rooted in traditional values, and there were some people that wanted to hold on to that. So we get a real conflict in the Weimar period, especially in these golden years of culture in the 1920s, where we get this conflict between people that have traditional values who want to resist the changes and kind of preserve their old way of life. And obviously that contrasts quite heavily with a lot of the more liberal people who wanted more freedom and wanted to experiment more. You know, you can look at that as an example when you think about the Berlin nightclubs. That's kind of an example of that change that some people wanted, and the offence that it caused with others kind of signals that real social divide in Germany. So the key thing from this little bit here is just to remember that it causes massive social divides. Okay, so the first area we're going to think about is living standards and the social welfare reforms. Now, there had been loads of different social welfare reforms that had been brought in under the Weimar government, which was led by the SPD in 1919. They'd done things before the Golden Age, like for instance saying that everybody was entitled to work and welfare. In 1919, they'd said the maximum working day should be 8 hours. They'd done things like extended the state insurance system to wives, daughters, and the disabled. So they'd already done lots of different things in the early part of the Weimar crisis years. And they had done that, you know, in spite of the fact that it was a substantial cost. Despite the fact that it was one of the factors that led to hyperinflation, they had promised that and they tried to fulfill that as well. Now, they do then build on this in the 1920s, and we can see here some further improvements that they brought in. So, for instance, in 1924, they made some improvements to the public assistance system, which helped provide help to the poor and the destitute. And in 1927, they introduced a national unemployment insurance system that was introduced to try and provide some benefits to people that weren't working. Now, this was actually the largest scheme of its type in the world and covered 17 million workers. And it was actually a really good offer because they said that they would give 75% of pay for 9 months if somebody was made unemployed. So they are offering a lot, and this was something that cost the government a lot of money, but they still provided this for lots of people. So there's lots of positives here about the German government's trying to improve the standard of living. Between 1924 and 1931 as well, they built another 2 million homes to try and address the housing crisis. This helped to reduce the problem of people being homeless as well. So there were lots of positives at this point. However, it wasn't a completely perfect system. So there's first of all a problem of the fact that they have to rely on foreign loans because they spend a lot of money on their social welfare provisions. For instance, they're spending about 26% of their gross national product, all of the basically the monetary value of what they produce in the country for that year. They are spending 26% of that in 1928 just on this public expenditure. So it is quite significant what they're spending. The other problem is that they are also having to be very careful with what they're spending because there's such a substantial number of people that require their help. It means that they end up doing things like introducing means tests, where they essentially use snoopers to go and check that claimants really do need the benefits that they're asking for. Now, there was some resentment over that. Some people didn't like the fact that they felt they'd been humiliated by the welfare system, the fact that they were being spied on. It wasn't particularly popular, but obviously it was something the government felt was necessary at that point. So overall, there were some amazing social welfare reforms put in place, much more advanced than in lots of other European countries at this point. But I don't want you to think that it meant that the living standard increased for all Germans. We've already seen from the economy video that there have been lots of problems for the farmers. The Mittelstand hadn't, experienced the same rise in living standards that other people had had. The business owners, they had improved in position in a way because of the better trading position of Germany, but obviously they also had to pay the industrial workers higher wages. So it wasn't all perfect for everybody. Certainly people in the cities were generally better off, but that wasn't necessarily shared geographically across the nation. So living standards and social welfare reforms, a positive step, but not everybody had really benefited from the changes. The next area you need to know about is the new woman. And we need to think about here, was this actually the reality for many women in Weimar Germany? Did their lives really change that much between being under the Kaiser and under the Weimar Republic? So the idea behind the new woman is that she was supposed to be free, independent, sexually liberated, and increasingly visible in public life. Now, according to the Constitution, women were now supposed to have equal access to voting rights, education, civil servant appointments, and also equal pay. But the reality is that they didn't get quite all of this that they were promised. In fact, the Civil Code of 1896 still remained in place. And essentially this said that when married, the husband had the right to decide on all matters concerning family life, including whether his wife works or not. So there was still this reality for many women that actually being married would certainly cost you a lot of your freedom. And actually, for a lot of women in Weimar Germany, just because the laws had changed and they'd been given this equal access didn't even mean that many wanted these changes. For example, the biggest women's organisation was the BDF, and this was the League of German Women. And this was something that 900,000 people joined, 900,000 women. And it supported really traditional family values. It supported kind of maternal responsibilities and the classic idea of what a woman should be. So in lots of ways, this idea of the new woman is more of a cultivated myth. Basically, the gender patterns have not really changed, despite the fact there had been some improvements for women in terms of education and work, which we'll look at now. There are three areas that we're going to look at when we're thinking about to what extent was this new woman a myth or a reality. We're going to be looking at employment, sexual freedom, and politics and public life. And you might recognise this sheet because we stuck this into your books last year. So first of all, thinking about employment. Now, the myth, the idea of the new woman is the idea that women now have complete equality in terms of employment rights. We've got statistics here that by 1925, 36% of the German workforce were women, which kind of gives us this indication that there's been real change and more women working. And also by 1933, there were 100,000 female teachers and 3,000 female doctors. Now, even though that seems very positive, we're going to think about the reality and how much that really changed. Now, first of all, if we're thinking about the amount of women working, yes, it's 36% of the workforce, but it had actually been 35% of the workforce in 1907. So it's not really been a substantial change in the number of women working. Now, women at this point do have more opportunity to have positions of a higher income and slightly more skilled workers. However, it is worth noting that many women were still banned from the kind of upper and advanced levels due to their education and the fact that there weren't as many women attending university at this point, and therefore that has an impact on what kind of jobs they would have in the future. So they've certainly made some strides towards, improvements for women in terms of employment, but it's not perfect. So, for instance, if we look at the reality, we can see the demobilisation laws after the war required women to leave their jobs so that the ex-soldiers could return. Now, there were 8 million German soldiers that returned, so a lot of those women had to give up their jobs. So, in lots of ways, the reality wasn't perfect. Also, there was still this idea that women would give up their employment when they got married. So in 1925, the statistics are that 2/3 of women that work are actually under the age of 25, and that presumably is because most of them would have been single at that point. Even women that had a job, they were sometimes paid less than men for doing the exact same work, normally around 20 to 40% lower. So this idea of equality in employment rights is something that we can absolutely challenge. They were making strides towards it, but still the reality is that many women ended up giving up their jobs when they got married, or they would do the same job and get a lower pay. Also, we know that there's lots of times where women were kind of criticised for being double earners, and they were blamed for male unemployment. We see that particularly when the Great Depression hits. Remember, the Reich Postal Service sack 1,000 women from their employers because they say that the jobs are needed for men. So in terms of employment, thinking about whether it's myth or reality, there's certainly been some strides that they're making, some positives, but it's not the perfect kind of improvement and equality that the Constitution promised. Thinking next about sexual freedom, well, if we think about the myth and this idea of the new woman, we know that she was supposed to be much more sexually free. Birth control became more widely available and the birth rate did decline. Divorce rates increased. They're about 3 times higher than they had been before the Weimar period. And there was also a rise in the number of abortions. By 1930, there were an estimated 1 million abortions per year. Now, thinking about the reality of that, the reality is that abortion is still a criminal offence. And because the fact that it's illegal, there are a lot of very dangerous abortions that go on. And there's an estimated 10 to 12,000 deaths every year from abortions. So we're saying that women were much more free, but actually many women still had to make a very difficult choice about whether to have that abortion or not. There was also a decline in the birth rate, which was attacked by the Conservative press, and politicians claimed that there had been a birth strike, which threatened the health of the nation. So essentially, even though lots of women wanted to kind of be much more free and work on employment rather than necessarily starting a family at such a young age, there was lots of criticisms of that. So is it really this new woman if she's still criticised in society? And obviously, things like birth control was still heavily frowned upon. Divorce and abortion was frowned upon by the church as well. And therefore, as Germany is a very Christian nation at this point, it's no surprise that actually the majority of the women aren't necessarily taking up this new idea of being much more free than before. So in terms of sexual freedom, it's not the perfect scenario that this new woman kind of envisaged. In terms of politics and public life, now there have been some improvements, obviously, with women getting equal voting rights and the right to be able to be a Reichstag deputy. Now, remember, that is a real triumph in comparison to other nations at this point. In 1919, when the Constitution is published, it says that men and women in Germany have to be 20 to vote. Obviously, in Britain at this point, it's quite unfair because women have to be much older and have to be 30 in order to be able to vote. So it is one of the most democratic systems, and there is this idea of equality of voting rights, which is definitely a positive move forward and in some ways represents this idea of the new woman. In 1919 as well, 41 women were elected to the Reichstag. However, the number of women deputies fell in subsequent elections. Now, there are some positives here. Obviously, we can see that it says here that there was a high proportion of female deputies in the Reichstag than there was in the House of Commons. So it's certainly doing well internationally, at least in comparison to Britain. And between 1919 and 1932, 112 women were elected to the Reichstag, about 7 to 10% of the amount of people that were Reichstag deputies. So certainly lots of positives. You know, women were more active in local government at a state and city level as well. Certainly some positives there. And obviously some very famous female politicians at this point. Obviously we've got Rosa Luxemburg as a kind of communist leader, but we've also got people like Clara Zetkin, who was a member of the KPD, and she was a member of the Reichstag from 1920 to 1933. So there are certainly some positive figures that we need to know about. However, if we think about the reality and whether this situation was perfect, well, actually no woman ever became a cabinet member during the Weimar Republic. So yes, they've been elected to the Reichstag, but they're not actually in those positions of power and those kind of key decision-making roles that had been really dominated by men. They also didn't have a female leader in the Weimar years, and only the communists, the KPD, made gender equality a key element in its programme. However, that party wasn't as appealing to women generally. So things aren't perfect in terms of politics and public life. There's certainly been some great strides made. However, it's not like there's total equality when it comes to women wanting to work in politics. But it's quite interesting to think about how this change came about, because when, in terms of the voting rights, essentially women didn't get it from this hard-fought battle like the suffragettes that we had in England at this point. It was actually just a product of the new democratisation. There hadn't been this mass call for women to have the vote. So I suppose you could argue that it might take a while for there to be real change, because it's not necessarily even been pushed forward by the majority of women at this point. So thinking about kind of tying up women, think about overall, to what extent was there a new woman? Well, theoretically, the situation for women and their lives had changed considerably. The amount of freedom that they were supposed to have had changed considerably. However, the reality was that for many married women, male standards continue to dominate. You know, we think about things like that civil code remains in place where men get to decide whether their wives work or not. And actually, in terms of long-term progress, whatever strides were made don't last anyway, because the Nazi regime obviously wanted to undo this progress and kind of go back to the more traditional role of the woman. So have a little think about, to what extent would you argue this is the new woman? To what extent was that a reality for the majority of women in Germany? Another key group that you need to know about is the youth. Now, it's described as them being another key battleground in the culture wars. Essentially, there were big problems with the way that people perceived the cultural changes, but there was also supposed to be lots of problems with young people in this period as well. Now, the reason why there was such a big problem is that the majority of people left school at 14, unless they were going to go to a gymnasium school, which was basically one where you had to sit an entrance exam, and it was for people that wanted to pursue a more academic career and route. So the idea is that most people would leave school at 14, and then they would start an apprenticeship, or they might start employment straight away. However, there's lots of problems in this period, because at this point there are fewer apprenticeships available, and therefore there's more youth unemployment. Now, young people suffered quite disproportionately with this. 17% of the people that were unemployed in the years 1925 to 1926 were part of the 14 to 21 age group. So a large majority of the young people were actually unemployed. Now, the reason why this is such a big issue is because there was a baby boom that happened between 1900 and 1910, and also many more people were trying to get jobs at a time when employers were reducing their workforces. Even during the economic golden age, there was still lots of problems with people being sceptical about how many workers they'd really need, people still worried about the impact of hyperinflation, so therefore it isn't a perfect scenario for those young people. Sometimes they're described as a bit of a lost generation, this one, in this aftermath of the First World War. Now, the government did try and help them. They tried to help them as much as they possibly could with things like a benefit system to help some young people, and they actually established day centres as well. These are basically job centres that try to help them develop the skills needed for work to make them more attractive for employers, and to try and mean that they could keep them busy as well and try and get them to do things like lots of sport as well, and just basically keep them entertained. They were worried that if they didn't give them something to do, they would turn to the life of crime. And at this point, particularly in the cities and particularly in working class areas, there were loads of these youth cliques, and there was a big concern about the amount of crime was increasing. You know, a lot of these youth cliques had initiation ceremonies that involved some kind of minor crime. So there was a lot of worry about this, and therefore the government felt that they needed to do something about it. But realistically, they couldn't completely solve this problem because there just weren't the jobs available. Now, we're going to see that they also did try and solve it through education, and trying to tackle these longer term problems through that. So we'll talk about that next. So, problems with the education system. First of all, obviously, the majority of the students before left at 14. You know, if they are leaving school, they then need to be able to go into some kind of apprenticeship or job. And obviously, a lot of those weren't available at this point. But that's not the only problem with the existing education system. There were other problems as well. For instance, the fact that the education system was Prussian. Now, when Germany was united, they basically just extended Prussia out into the rest of Germany, and Prussia used to dominate in lots of different ways. So that meant that essentially the education system hadn't been well thought out for the whole of the united Germany. About 90% of people as well attended denominational schools. Essentially, they attended separated and segregated schools based on religion. They had lots of different types of schools that people would go to, and there was a really unfair system where if you were upper class, you often went to higher education and university, and if you were working class, you would often leave school at an earlier age. So therefore, the big issue is that the education system is divided along class lines, and therefore people who go to gymnasium schools are mainly the middle and upper classes, and that is something the Weimar politicians wanted to change. You know, this is still an issue that we are tackling, you know, now, and it was certainly an issue back in the 1920s as well. So the government did try various things to try and deal with the problems in the education system, the fact that they were divided by religion, the fact they were divided by class, and they did want to try and reform it. So first of all, they introduced state-funded 4-year primary schools for German pupils. So there wouldn't be any religious or class segregation. It would also mean that lower class children could then access higher education as well, because they had the same sort of starting point for the first 4 years. However, it didn't really succeed. There was an initiative for educational reform that was then left to individual states to try and implement. And a lot of them didn't really take up this idea. A lot of the local governments weren't actually as passionate about this as some of the Weimar main politicians. Furthermore, they had wanted to try and end that religious divide between the Catholics and the Protestants, and actually it didn't really have any impact whatsoever, because in Prussia in the 1930s, 90% still attended denominational schools. So essentially, there hadn't been enough funding or commitment in order to actually cause real change. There was still that issue of class divide, which had such a significant impact on the future jobs and prospects of all the young people. The final area that we need to know about for the youth is about the youth groups. Now, generally these gained in popularity in the 1890s and they continued throughout Weimar. It's estimated there are about 2,000 different youth organisations. However, there were about 400 that were significant by 1933. Many of them were religiously or politically orientated, and we'll see that as we talk through them now. So the main group to know about is the Wandervogel. These were a group that was a male-only group that was particularly important from the 1890s. So they're not actually associated with Weimar Germany itself, but they still grew in popularity during Weimar. Now, Wandervogel basically means wandering birds. These are a group of people who basically rejected industrialization and they wanted to spend a lot of time hiking in forests and swimming in lakes and basically about kind of going back to nature. It had been started by a school teacher who was frustrated at the industrial life, and therefore it was a group that was very much about freedom. It wasn't supposed to be political, but it was quite nationalistic, and it did have this really romanticised view of Germany's past, where they wanted to go back to the simpler days. So that's the Wandervogel, kind of seen as a non-political group, but it's still got elements of an ideology that they're kind of pushing through there. Thinking about the church as well, we're seeing that the church really dominated in terms of schools and that the majority of students attended a school based on their religion. Both the Catholics and the Protestants also had their youth groups, and they were both about promoting religious observance and instilling respect for the church, family and school to try and make sure that these people grew up to be good Christians. You know, we know how important, for instance, the Catholic youth groups were to the church, because we can see that with the 1933 in July, the Concordat, where the deal was made about the Centre Party allowing Hitler to have political freedom in return for them leaving the church schools and youth groups alone. So we know how important it was. The Catholics had lots of different youth groups aimed at young people. For instance, they had a youth group called New Germany that was aimed at the middle classes. The Protestants didn't give youth work as a high priority, and their groups generally had fewer members, but they did still have some youth groups. So thinking about the political groups then, you know, these become increasingly more important over time, and especially in Nazi Germany as well. All of the political groups had their own youth sections. The most popular in Weimar, though, was the SPD, the Social Democratic Youth Movement, which had been formed in 1925. The KPD also had one, the DNVP also had the Bismarck Youth that was linked to it, and they have got over 42,000 members by 1928. So these are quite substantial in size, and remember the SPD one is even bigger. Now, the Hitler Youth had actually been founded in 1926 as well, but obviously it was much smaller scale. Remember, even in 1928, they only have 12 seats in the Reichstag and 2.6% of the vote. So it's not going to be as big as groups like the SPD's youth movement, but they still had 13,000 members in 1929. Now, a lot of these members of these youth groups end up becoming of age for voting at the end of the Weimar period, and these are a key group for the Nazis and other political groups to try and utilise and get them to vote for them in the future. So the political groups here are really important. So now we've come to the end of looking at the youth. Just make sure you're really clear about what the problems were. Maybe make sure that you've got a statistic that you can remember about youth unemployment and what the main issues were for the youth, and whether you think Weimar was successful in tackling those issues. So another group to make sure that we know about is the Jewish people and what their experience of the Weimar Golden Age was like. This is important on its own to think about the 1920s and to what extent it was a golden age, but it's also a really important foundation for knowing about Unit 4 and what it was like for Jewish people in Nazi Germany as well. Now, first of all, it's worth noting that Jewish people had been given legal equality in 1871. So when Germany was united together, the new constitution under the Kaiser had said that they were given legal equality. However, in reality, that did not always translate to social equality. Now, a really big issue at this point is that even though many German Jews had lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years and their families had been there for generations, there was still this idea that they couldn't shake, that they were somehow alien, somehow foreign in some way, and they were often viewed as that by other Germans. Now, they're actually quite a small percentage of the population. The German Jews made up 1% of the total population, about 500,000 of them living in Germany. About 80% of them lived in the cities and they were really well educated, and then obviously the others are living in the countryside. Now, many of them wouldn't have even described themselves as being necessarily Jewish in terms of their identity. Many felt more German than Jewish. They were intensely patriotic and they wanted to become fully assimilated and integrated and accepted in mainstream German society. And there was lots of, for instance, marriages between people that were Jewish and people that were German. So this wasn't something that was unusual, and yet there was still this idea that they were somehow different. Now, they had some remarkable achievements that we'll talk more about in a second, and lots of people have argued that their increased visibility and the success of these communities actually added resentment and long-term prejudice against them. So it wasn't a perfect situation for Jewish people at this point. They weren't fully accepted. There was that element of anti-Semitism that sometimes bubbled, especially when there was any economic difficulties, like for instance during hyperinflation and during the Great Depression. So there was also, as well as this economic jealousy, I suppose, there was also growing anti-Semitism after the war. You know, there was this idea that Jewish politicians had signed the armistice because one of the people that had signed the armistice was somebody called Erzberger, who was a pacifist Jewish person, and you might remember he was actually assassinated as well. We've also got people like Rosa Luxemburg at this point, who is obviously a female Jewish politician, and that helps give some credibility to this idea of Jewish Bolshevism. Obviously, the reality is that contradicts the idea of Jewish capitalists, but there is basically this resentment of Jewish people for being both communist and greedy. So there is these really kind of horrible, completely false ideas about Jewish people at this point, and that doesn't really go away. It's been around in Germany for a long point, and it certainly bubbles at certain points as well. So we'll look at what the achievements were now. As you can see here, we've got a long list of the achievements of Jewish communities in Weimar, Germany. So first of all, we're not going to have to remember all of these. You're going to pick maybe, let's say, 3 or 4 that you're going to try and remember if you can as evidence for exam answers. For instance, 16% of all of Germany's lawyers were Jewish, 11% of all their doctors were Jewish. Rathenau was obviously quite a key figure, had signed things like the Treaty of Rapallo, and he was the foreign minister. Obviously, remember, he was assassinated, and that caused mass outrage in Germany at that point as well. We also have people like Rosa Luxemburg, who had been a member of the KPD and obviously one of the leaders in the Spartacus uprising. We've also got the Rothschilds. You might have heard of them before because they had the largest private fortune in the world at this point. So they're essentially the richest family. There is this claim that lots of Jewish people owned banks. In reality, 18% of the banks were owned by Jewish people, but that figure was actually declining in the 1920s. 25% of Nobel Prize winners were Jewish, including people like Albert Einstein. And the Rathenaus, the family of Walter Rathenau, who had been foreign minister, they controlled a huge electrical company called AEG. They also dominated lots of coal mining and steelworks and chemical industries. So these are all, fantastic achievements, considering that this group in German society only represents 1% of the population. It's quite striking to think about the fact that 16% of lawyers were Jewish. But obviously that is down to individuals working hard and, people striving to have all of these educated jobs. It doesn't matter what the reasons why they took those are. What's important in the kind of the scheme of learning that we're doing is thinking about the impact of that on German society, and it makes them even more fragmented and even more anti-Semitic when they feel that these achievements are basically kind of out of proportion with the rest of German society. So there's a real resentment at times of economic difficulty of the Jewish people in Germany. And as we mentioned before, it's kind of bubbling under the surface. Obviously, greater criticism when it comes to things like the Great Depression and hyperinflation and all of those issues. We've already mentioned lots of stuff about the extent of assimilation, so this has just got a few points on it to look at if you want to. So just quickly then, essentially there was still this idea that Jews were somehow alien, somehow separate to the rest of German society. Even though many had fully assimilated, there was this idea of not completely accepting them. I mean, if we think about the statistics of the amount of mixed marriages between people that were German Jews and people that were just kind of identifying as German and weren't Jewish in terms of their religion, 54% of all marriages of Jews were to non-Jewish people. So there was certainly a level of assimilation, but still this sense of them somehow being separate and different. Obviously, it talks about the fact that this anti-Semitism was pushed to the fringes of public and political life as Germany experienced a golden age, but as soon as there was any kind of economic problem, it would often resurface. There was also things like the Barmat scandal of 1925, where 3 Polish Jewish businessmen were convicted of bribing public officials to obtain loans from the Prussian State Bank and the National Post Office. One of those brothers was accused of war profiteering, which was seen as a really serious crime in World War I, because he'd exported food from the Netherlands to Germany and made a lot of profit, obviously during a time when 400,000 people had died of malnutrition and starvation. So it's things like that and stories like that being widely published that are just reinforcing this idea of the Jewish community somehow being separate and kind of reinforcing, you know, these terrible stereotypes of Jewish people that had been around for a long time across much of Europe and places like Russia as well. So that's the extent of assimilation. Obviously pause it and have a little look through it if you need to. Okay, so the next area we need to think about is moving on to culture and about the cultural changes. Now we need to know examples about all the different types of culture, but you also need to be aware of your own opinions on whether you would call it a cultural golden age. Now, generally exam questions on this unit can ask you to what extent was Germany a golden age, to what extent was it prosperous, all those kind of things. In terms of culture, if they mention it, we're thinking a golden age of culture is a period when a specified art or activity is at its peak. You know, a lot of people see the 1920s as the roaring 20s, and they see it as this kind of golden age of culture, both in Germany and elsewhere as well. So why is Germany seen as a cultural golden age? Well, during the 1920s, they witnessed an explosion of creativity in art, architecture, music, literature, theatre, film and music. For lots of people, they saw Berlin as the heart of European cultural activity and innovation. You know, it really challenged cities like Paris at this point for being this cultural centre. Now, the roots of their culture predated 1914 and came from Imperial Germany, but essentially the idea is that they're challenging these old ideas of being quite conservative and authoritarian. There's a lot more freedom, it's a lot more liberal after World War I because they're doing things like ending censorship, and they are essentially more about things like expressionism. They are focusing basically a lot more on emotion rather than reality. You know, especially soon after the First World War, that is essentially the kind of the movement that affects things like art and literature. It's very much looking at emotion rather than physical reality. But it does start to change by the mid-1920s, and we get a period of new objectivity, which is focusing on things like the practical engagement with the world, especially when we look at things like architecture as well. So for culture, we need to be aware of the fact that the majority of people argue it was a cultural golden age. You need to be aware of the different movements of expressionism and new objectivity, but we'll talk about those more as we look at the different forms of culture. Okay, so the key bit of culture to know about is things like the Berlin nightclubs, because it contrasts so heavily with censorship and the kind of society that was very conservative around in Imperial Germany under the Kaiser. So the idea is that these Berlin nightclubs, like you can see in that picture there, is it's all about epitomising freedom. They're renowned for their cabarets, which often involve things like nudity, but the idea was that you would go and have your dinner whilst watching a show basically at the same time. Now, a very famous nightclub in Berlin was called the El Dorado, and that was described by somebody that went to go and visit it as a supermarket of eroticism. So you can imagine kind of what these cabarets were like. Now, what was so different about these cabarets was the fact that people were able to be so much more open than they had been under the conservative governments of the Kaiser. So people that were gay, people that were transvestites were able to, for the first time ever really, display it very openly. And it was also a real change in terms of music as well, and fashions and things like that. I mean, if we think about a lot of these cabarets, they involved lots of jazz music. A lot of people saw that as this unwelcome foreign influence, but the majority of people in the cities liked, this new music. There was this real Americanization of culture that lots of people liked. A lot of people liked the fact that cabarets didn't take themselves too seriously and they mocked the conventions of old Germany. But it's really something that was quite divisive. People either loved the cabarets, certainly younger generations in the cities were more for them, or they caused real horror and contempt for those people that didn't like this new sort of Germany as well. So there was this idea that they undermined existing German culture, but the majority of younger people in the cities were quite supportive of it and saw this as something that kind of epitomised this new, modern, freer society. So that's the first area you need to know about. We're going to go through and look at lots of different aspects of culture. So we've just mentioned about the Berlin nightclubs. Remember that you should have lots of sheets that were made by you guys where you've got a handout of all the key points for all the different forms of culture. You can use those as well as the slides of information that we've got here. Now, the next area that we need to be aware of is about art in the Golden Age. Now, we've mentioned that particularly Expressionism had an impact here already. Remember, Expressionism is this idea of, drawing things that evoke more emotion and being more about your emotional state rather than being about actual reality and trying to draw things that look, as they do in real life. It was very much about drawing those kind of feelings and thoughts and things like that. So two famous artists that I do really want you to make sure you know about are George Grosz and Otto Dix, and you can see their names are put on this sheet here. They're really good examples to remember. So if we just have a little quick look at one of these pieces of work by George Grosz, this is a piece called The Eclipse of the Sun. You can see that the kind of figures here have not been showing very favourably at all. I mean, if you look at any of the work by George Grosz or Otto Dix, for instance, like this wounded soldier from World War One, you can see that it's really been drawn in quite a kind of seedy and aggressive style. The idea is that it's kind of conveying this quite strong social and political message, and often criticizing war or criticisms of society. So very much critical pieces that were liked by some and very much detested by people who preferred more conservative, realistic art. A lot of people hated particularly Otto Dix's work on World War One because they saw it as disrespectful, and it didn't really go with these ideas of the glory of war. So quite new ideas in art, some amazing artwork. Lots of it has actually been lost because the Nazis destroyed a lot of it when they came to power, but some amazing art that represents this idea of expressionism, and that's a really good example to use. So I would think about trying to remember one of these portraits, wounded soldier or war cripple. Any of those are good examples that you could use in an exam. So it's not only about things like art that we need to know about, we also need to think about the growth of mass culture that's going on at this point. Now, this is the result of things like urbanisation, the growth of consumer goods and new means of communication, and obviously things like music, the radio, cinemas, films, they are reaching a lot more ordinary people than previously. For instance, if we think about things like the radios, the German radio company was first set up in 1923. By 1932, 1 in 4 households owned one. However, only 10% of households in small villages would have one. It was a much higher percentage, of about 46% in the cities. But still, that kind of shows us about why music became even more important at this point, because people are able to access it a lot more within their own homes. The other area of mass culture to make sure you're really aware of is about films and the cinema. Now, at this point, Berlin becomes the important centre for world cinema, and it's actually in lots of ways bigger than anywhere else in Europe. There are actually 500 cinemas by the end of the 1920s, and there are more cinemas in Germany than anywhere else in Europe. Now, there's lots of different films that you can remember, but the two that I would remember are Metropolis and Blue Angel. Now, Metropolis was directed by somebody called Fritz Lang, and this was a film that was all about criticising this new modern society. Basically, the plot is that there is this beautiful city that you can see in this top picture here if you're looking at this and not just listening to it. You can see that beautiful city, a real utopia, sits above an underworld of mistreated workers who are basically responsible for this beauty. So it's a real criticism of industrial society. But as well as those films like Metropolis, we've also got other films like The Blue Angel, which this time was directed by Sternberg. Basically, that was a very famous film because it was the first big German talkie or talking film, and it was released in both English and German, which shows the international appeal of films like that. The film is very much, again, kind of quite critical of this new society in a way, because a nightclub singer essentially seduces an innocent old professor and ends up ruining his life. So it's another take on society. Both are quite critical there, but it's not always about critical films. There was also real popularity of people like Charlie Chaplin, which shows actually as well that Weimar culture was not always solely German, just like the film Metropolis was. This is something that is part of a mass international culture. The fact that they are celebrating film stars from other nations, even the Blue Angel being released in both English and German. We're not talking there about subtitles, we're talking about completely filming it in English as well. That shows the kind of international impact that the German cinema had. Okay, so there are another few areas that you need to know about. So we've got on here about theatre, architecture and literature. So in terms of theatre, there were lots of expressionist ideas that were often incorporated into the play. They were often very political as well, attacking things like capitalism, nationalism and war. There's quite a few links there to, for instance, the artwork of people like Otto Dix as well. Now, if you are going to try and remember some details about theatre, an example that I think is a great one to use in exams is a threepenny opera. Now, this was a really famous play that was created in Weimar, Germany. It was this real savage left-wing satire that treated the respectable middle classes like they were the villains, whilst making heroes of criminals and prostitutes, the people that would normally be seen negatively in Weimar society. It was so successful that it was played 400 times in 2 years, and it was even translated into 18 languages by 1933. So it had this real international appeal at that time, and therefore we can see the kind of the heart of Weimar culture is that it's also spreading out globally. Another area to be aware of is about architecture and the massive changes that happened with architecture in Weimar, Germany. For instance, we get the founding of the Bauhaus movement by a man called Gropius in 1919. This is all about completely radically changing architecture from what it used to be. The motto of this new Bauhaus school of architecture and the kind of, wider movement that it represents is about uniting art and technology. So you can see the motto was art and technology, a new unity. It was basically about trying to make sure that function was at the heart of design. They wanted to strip away all of the unnecessary decoration that there was often on buildings. They wanted it to be more about materials like concrete, about being more practical. And it was supposed to be about, you know, function above all else. So we see this influences the types of buildings that are created. If you Google the Bauhaus buildings, you'll see they're very much modern, very different to the kind of Victorian styles that had been around much before. And it was very much an influence on architecture as well as things like furniture, urban planning, pottery, textiles. All these different areas were influenced by it, and it had such a long lasting impact. You know, a lot of those ideas are still used in architecture today. So that's definitely something that you want to look at and kind of remember a few details about. And then the last area there that I've got is about literature. So again, thinking about some examples to be able to use, I think the best example to remember is about Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, an incredibly famous book, you know, seen as one of the real classics. And this was a book that critiqued World War One, that had real mass appeal in the aftermath of the First World War. It was published for the first time in 1929. And it sold 500,000 copies. So that is a great book to use because I think it represents the main changes with literature. You know, a lot of writing was written with a real social and political purpose. A lot of it was also influenced by expressionism and writing about the character's mental state rather than physical reality. So there's loads of different examples you can look at. You've got a handout on lots of different books. And you can look up others, but I think Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front is definitely the one that I'd try and remember. So thinking then about the impact of culture. Now, obviously, the culture itself is incredibly important, and you want to make sure you know some of those examples. But also what's really important to understand is what impact it had on Weimar society, and the fact that in some ways it divided them even further. An already fragmented society was further divided by the cultural changes. Now, there's a really great article on this that I've put on Teams that's called 2.2 Culture Article Summary. That would be a great example to look at if you're still feeling a little bit unsure about the main changes with culture. Essentially, thinking about the criticisms, the German people, as we already know, were very much divided by class, religion, and political views, but they were also really divided by culture. In many of the small and rural towns in particular, the influence of the church was incredibly strong, and many of them believed that these new cultural changes were a negative thing. You know, there was lots of conservative ideas, for instance, about the role of women. You know, there was great outrage about changes even in women's fashion and things in the 1920s, and about even things like people wearing stuff that showed their knees. So there was this real divide between the people who had very conservative reactions to this and felt that these changes represented real cultural decay. You know, the Centre Party and the DNVP actually publicly campaigned against the culture and called them the tides of filth. So there was people that really hated it, but there was also people that really celebrated it and loved it and really liked this time of innovation. You know, there's a historian called Polzer who said that the chaotic creativity of Weimar Germany made Weimar the mecca of so many foreigners, and it was so crucial in kind of helping Germany's international appeal. However, the consequence of that is that it made a lot of people want a conservative revolution. You know, it made some people support groups like the Nazis who wanted to go back to traditional roots. So positive in lots of ways for some people, and very negative in other ways for other people. But what we can't deny is the fact that it caused even more division in German society. So make sure that you know about the key changes in culture, but also think about the impact and think about what you know about German society. Would you say that it is unified? Would you say that it was a golden age for society and culture as a whole? Think about those views now we're at the end of this topic. Well done for listening to the knowledge overview on society and culture. Now that you've listened to it, you need to make sure that you are then doing something with the information. So maybe make some revision materials. You could make a Cornell grid or a revision clock or some mind maps. You could then do a red pen and black pen activity, maybe a day later or later that day, just to see what you can remember and then what you still need to work on. If you're, a little bit shaky, let's say on culture, then you go back and just watch that bit of the video. Remember, the idea is that you can watch this as many times as you need to get that information to the forefront of your memories, ready for the mocks and the exams. So the last thing to do, once you've done some revision materials and you feel comfortable with the knowledge, or you could even do it before as a way of getting more comfortable and confident with the knowledge, is to plan out some exam questions. Remember, it's the best thing you can do. It helps you practice exam technique. It helps keep you calm in the exams because it's something you're very used to. And I would have a go at planning out this exam question, which says German society was overwhelmingly conservative and traditional in the years 1924 to 1929. Assess the validity of this view. Remember, there's lots more questions that you can plan, and I'll mark anything that you give me. Okay, well done.